here since 2001, as Shadir said. I have worked in the tourism industry since that time, and I've been visiting the Maldives since 1993 as a tourist as well. And it's through my interest in diving with mantas that I started to ask questions about their behaviour, their movements, how many mantas I was seeing at cleaning stations and so forth. And I started gathering data so that I could answer some very basic questions like, was I seeing the same manta at a particular cleaning station every week? Is that the same female manta that was here 5 minutes ago, or is it a different one? So I developed an identification method so that I could identify whether I was looking at like 1, 2, 5, 10 mantas on a particular dive. Some of the research that I'm going to show you today is my own research, and others, it comes from other people who've been concurrently researching at the same time as me, because there's been research going on in East Africa, Australia, throughout the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, in fact. So now we have a great body of information about manta rays. So let's kick off. We now know that there are 2 species of manta. Now 10 years ago, or even more recently than that, it was assumed that there was just 1 species. And this led to a lot of confusion. If you look in textbooks about manta rays or sharks and mantas, they will talk about the giant species. It's called Manta birostris in the books, and that's pretty much all you'll find. If you go on the internet, then you'll find that there are monographs on 2 species. So let's go back to where we were. We are now talking about definitely being 2 species of manta, and we get them both in the Maldives. We have Manta birostris, which is the giant manta or oceanic manta, and I'm going to talk about it as Manta birostris or MV, just to make it easy. And there's also Manta alfredi, which is the common one in the Maldives, and that's commonly known as an Alfred manta or a reef manta. It is proposed that there's possibly a 3rd species of manta, which is endemic to the Caribbean and to the east coast of America, the Northern Americas, which is still being researched as to decide whether there is a 3rd separate species or not. And like I said, we do get both of the recognised species in the Maldives. However, the giant manta, the Manta birostris, is much rarer, and at the moment I've only got about 12 of the giant manta. Now, I have got 12 Manta birostris compared with about 2,200 of the Alfred manta here. So here's a photograph of the ventral side, and as you can see, they look quite different. And this was one of the reasons why I identified, from my original observations of manta rays, that we have a strange manta that visits the Maldives, which is Manta birostris, because the one on the right, which is Manta alfredi, that is the common one. And I'm going to talk you through how to identify them. So if you're looking at photographs and you're looking in textbooks, you'll be able to identify what the photographs are and what the book is talking about. So first of all, the ventral side, the underside, is usually white in colour generally. The area marked 1, the area between the gill slits, on Manta alfredi, there are normally oval or diamond-shaped marks, whereas in Manta birostris, it is always plain white. On Manta alfredi, you get little marks at the end of the gill slit, so these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gill slit, and you'll see a little dark mark at the end, usually the 5th and the 4th gill slit. Whereas on Manta birostris, these are very large marks, big half-moon shapes. As you can see, there's kind of shadowy marks on the other ends of the gill slit. Then we have the abdominal marks, which on alfredi tend to be spots, very round spots, anything between 5 centimetres and 10 centimetres in diameter. Whereas on birostris, they tend to be much larger marks, and often the kind of oval marks or diamond marks that you get on alfredi are seen in birostris in this area. I said this area, there are never any marks. And then, very importantly, on birostris, they have this very boldly delineated margin. Now this one is in a very extreme version, because this one is almost black. You see on alfredi, it's only a very subtle shadowing. Whereas this one, the mark goes all the way, the pigmentation goes all the way to the tip of the wingtips and covers the genitalia as well. But sometimes it's a partial, so maybe this area is shaded and not the genitalia, or maybe the area around the genitalia is shaded but not to the wingtips. Anyway, it's very distinctive. You look at a photograph and straight away you can identify which species you're looking at. In addition, there are some anatomical differences, which are sometimes a little harder to see, or they're hard to differentiate. First of all, it's the size. A giant manta is not a giant manta by accident. You're talking a disc width of up to 7 metres. Okay, so 7 metres is about the length of this stage. So we're looking at a very large animal, and a full-grown Manta birostris swimming up the reef is it's a sight to behold. A Manta alfredi grow to about 4.5 metres, particularly in the Maldives. So there will be a difference when you see the two species if you saw them together. But usually birostris will be bigger than Manta alfredi. However, of course, Manta birostris are born small and they grow large. So when they're young of either species, they could be mistaken for each other from the size. Secondly, they have teeth, only small teeth, but nevertheless teeth. And in the birostris species, it's in both rows. So that's the upper and lower part of the jaw, whereas in alfredi, it's only in the lower jaw. But we don't often get a chance to look inside the manta's mouth, so I'm just going to assume that you don't get a chance to identify that. Thirdly, Manta birostris has a little bobble in front or behind the dorsal fin, so just in front of the tail. This protuberance is of cartilaginous material and contains a little thorn. It's usually absent in Manta alfredi, but I and other researchers in the Maldives have identified that occasionally Manta alfredi have this little bobble as well, so it's not distinctive to the species. Lastly, it's the markings. Both species will have a V-shaped mark just in front of the tail, which is called the chevron in the black and white versions, the chevron version. Okay? And then on Manta birostris, they have the very bold shoulder bars with a very distinctive black gap in the middle, whereas Manta alfredi has much more blurry sort of a collar, which sometimes joins in the middle, and this mark, the white area, can join to the wingtips and down to the chevron. So it's a lot more variable. The distinctive item is that birostris has this black gap between the very geometrical shoulder bars. I mentioned in the last slide we were talking about chevron mantas, the black and white versions. There are actually black versions of both species. These are both photographs taken from the Maldives, and they are both of Manta birostris. This one on the left was taken at Kalahandi in Ari Atoll, and this one on the right was taken at Hanifaru in Bar Atoll. For some reason, we do not have black alfredi in the Maldives. I don't know why. It's very interesting, and I'd be interested to hear from other researchers elsewhere, because it appears that in other areas there seems to be a high proportion of black Manta alfredi. But anyway, it must be a genetic difference here, but that has yet to be interpreted or identified. The markings on Manta alfredi are very distinctive and distinct, and they are there throughout the life of the animal. So Manta is born with these marks, and they will still be present certainly 15, 20, 30, 40 years on. So these marks can be used for individual identification, because each animal is so different. It takes maybe a little experience to understand that, but I'll show you a few examples and you'll understand. So the markings alone can be used to identify individuals, and the markings generally can be used to identify species. The good thing with having this method of identification is that we don't need to tag individuals to be able to re-identify an animal if it goes to a different place or it appears on a different day. And this is something which I picked up very quickly when I was watching mantas, that every time you went and looked at a manta, it's like, oh, it's the one with the 3 big spots. Oh, this one hasn't got 3 big spots, it's got two and something blurry. So it was like, I know I'm looking at a different manta. It's really easy. And it's nice because you can quickly recognise these patterns and shapes, and you can re-identify mantas, from one sighting to the next. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples on the next slide. So starting on the top right, we have a very plain set of markings here with no actual markings between the gill slits. Now, we do get Manta alfredi which don't have marks between the gill slits, But this one has very distinctive markings in the abdominal area, these kind of big blotches and a few spots. So these will remain the same for years and years and years, so you can re-identify this one. This one on the left, we're looking at an interim set, so this is two very large sets of marks between the gill slits, plus some distinctive spots in the abdominal, and down here we have a very complicated set of ovoids between the gill slits, and again, blotchy mottles. So you can easily tell these three individuals apart, because this one has none, this one has two large ones, and this one has maybe 15 or so different ovals. So you can watch an individual as they're swimming around and keep track of them as they're moving around on the cleaning station or feeding area. Still, little is actually known about manta rays. We still don't know how old a manta ray can live till. We have the world's oldest known manta is a Mali-based manta, who we know as Brenda. She was identified from a photograph in the mid-1980s when she was adult. We know she was adult because she was pregnant. So from that, we can say, well, she was at least, say, 13, 15 in the mid-1980s, and that would make her around 40 now. I must admit, I haven't seen Brenda for a couple of years, but I have reason to believe she's probably still around. And the fact is, we don't know how old she actually is, because we are assuming she's a minimum of 40. There are bands that you can count on the vertical sections of other elasmobranchs. In fact, there's some quite interesting research recently on great white sharks, which actually showed that great whites are actually considerably older than they thought, certainly, again, 70 plus years old. But unfortunately, at the moment, there is not a good method for identifying the age in manta rays. But there are other species that we know, even much smaller species than the great white. The reference here I've given you is the spiny dogfish, which only grows to about 170 centimetres, which is a bit taller than me, and yet is known to be 65, 70 years old. So I think we can conclude that manta ray probably lives to 60, 70, maybe older. Manta rays are born as small replicas of their parents. So a manta, when it's born, looks exactly like an adult, just much smaller. The mantas born in aquaria have been born at a size just under 2 metres. Okay, so when you consider that the mother was maybe 4 metres across and the offspring was 2 metres across, you're looking at a very large baby compared with the mother. And there's a very large amount of investment, physically, that the parent manta puts into the offspring. A pregnancy lasts about 12.5 months. Okay, so again, a very long pregnancy. And we often see very heavily pregnant females around lagoon areas throughout the Maldives, particularly around Rasfari. Even Hulumali, we've seen female mantas and small mantas in the lagoons. And we believe that, I believe, that the mantas, the juvenile, the baby mantas are actually born inside these sheltered lagoons in common with black-tip sharks, stingrays, lemon sharks. There are many other species of elasmobranch which are born in these very sheltered lagoons and probably spend the first few years of their lives in these lagoons, because that way they're protected from large predators like tide sharks, hammerhead sharks and so forth, which might otherwise eat the young offspring. I'm currently researching this subject and investigating how long the juveniles are spending in the lagoons before they then move on to be pelagic, living in the open ocean, same as their parents, same as the adults. So what do mantas get up to? So in a day, this is their diurnal activity. During the day, mantas are usually seen visiting shallower reefs where they spend their downtime. The days are usually, they are kind of nocturnal feeders, or primarily nocturnal feeders, or that's what is believed. And so during the day, they visit cleaning stations, they'll visit feeding areas where there is the right kind of food, and they just swim around or hang in current. I'm going to show you a little video in a moment. So we often see them around the reefs during the day. At night, they start to swim away from the shallow waters and go out into deeper water to feed. But they can be attracted into shallow lagoons by the presence of lights, and I'm going to show you a short video about that in a moment. But certainly from about midnight onwards, they're out in deep water, and I mean certainly 50 to 150, 200 metres of water, feeding on plankton, zooplankton, which is shrimps, crabs, that kind of plankton, which rises during the night. There have been several studies showing this outside of the Maldives, and there's been some study to certainly support what's been seen elsewhere in the Maldives, not my research, but this seems to be a common behaviour. So manta rays visit shallow reefs during the day, but tend to go offshore at night. So these are the adults. Okay, so here we have several mantas hovering in the water column, and I believe that many mantas during the day just hover in channels. We certainly see them in places where you get strong current. Not necessarily very shallow, they're often down at 30, 40 metres, just hovering in a strong current. And it's very similar behaviour to that which you see by grey sharks when they're just hovering on the front of channels. And it is kind of time out, kind of relaxing. They're not really feeding or doing anything, they're just taking time out. In this particular case, this site is also a cleaning station area. And when the current becomes smaller, it becomes more conducive to them actually approaching the cleaning station and actually visiting to be cleaned by the small cleaner wrasse. You can see there's a number of mantas just hovering in the current. And I've spent a lot of time at this particular site, and they will hover there for hours and hours at a time. And they're just kind of literally like aeroplanes sort of stacking up down the channel, not really going anywhere, just hovering in the current. And so when the current starts to drop, then they start to approach the cleaning station. This unfurling of the fins, the cephalic fins, the head fins, is usually an indicator that they are looking for a cleaning station, and then they'll start to approach. This manta is hovering over the actual blocks. The coral itself is the home for the cleaner fish. Unfortunately, the photographer has probably disturbed this manta. But this one, the cephalic fins are open. You can see there's a little cleaner wrasse visiting the manta. And they will spend anything between 20 minutes, half an hour a day, and up to 4 or 5 hours cleaning, being cleaned, depending on the occasion. Manta rays don't seem to have to clean every single day, probably clean something like once a week on average. But certain individuals will visit a cleaning station every day, whilst other animals will visit maybe once or twice a month. The initial research seems to suggest that they have particular cleaning stations that they like to visit, and certain individuals will visit a particular cleaning station over and over again on a very regular basis. Okay, so I also mentioned about feeding at night, and this is a slightly artificial feeding environment. This has been created by using the lights at the back of the safari boat. We noticed that the fishing boats here were using very large lights to attract bait fish, and they were often attracting whale sharks. And so we've tried it in a few places, and now we've realised that we can actually attract manta rays that visit the back of boats in lagoons as well, because there's a lot of small shrimp and krill in many of the lagoons. And you can see this is feeding behaviour with the animals somersaulting in the areas of high concentration of shrimps. So the light on the surface is creating a kind of curtain of light through the water column. This is attracting high concentrations of shrimps, krill, to come into the light, and the animal is somersaulting because this somersault behaviour, it feeds in the same area over and over again. The curtain where the shrimps are concentrated it can be anything up to 15 metres deep using artificial light. What I would like you to imagine is this kind of behaviour in really deep water, where we've got lots of animals feeding, possibly in cooperation, and they are often following each other, and it's quite dynamic behaviour. Normally when they're feeding, they're swimming much, much more quickly than they are when they're cleaning. In fact, it's about 50% generally, the wing beat movement is 50% faster. So feeding behaviour is quite dynamic. And they'll feed for hours. In the artificial environments we create, if we put the lights in at 7 o'clock in the evening, they'll still be feeding 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning if you leave the lights in. Okay, so back to their environment. So the distribution of the two species. This is based on sightings around the world. And if I talk about Birostrus first, this is the large species, and it is actually seen throughout the world's oceans. And they travel into relatively cold water. They're quite happy to happily tolerate 10, 11, 12 degrees of water, and can be seen as far north as Newfoundland, as far south as New Zealand, certainly travelling up into the Japanese islands, into northern Europe, southern Europe, certainly into Portugal, all the way along the western coastline of Africa, the eastern Pacific area, that are actually absent in this Caribbean area if we say that this third species is based in this area. Whereas the smaller species, Manta alfredi, is certainly seen in the Indian Ocean and throughout the Pacific in warmer water areas. There have been odd sightings, very infrequent sightings from the west coast of Africa, and it is speculated that it may be single individuals which travel down around the coast, the South African coast, and then travel up the western coast of Africa, because there is no regular population of alfredis reported from that area. And this is the point. Throughout the areas where the mantas are seen, the giant mantas are seen usually on a seasonal basis, whereas the smaller manta, the Manta alfredi, is seen much more regularly. Okay, so as I say, Manta virostris tends to be seen on offshore islands. So these are like seamounts which rise up from the bottom of the ocean, so like an underwater mountain which breaks the surface. Yeah. So Galapagos, Ecuador, Eastern Pacific islands, throughout French Polynesia, in southern Japan, and in the Maldives, they are seen infrequently. As I said, it's usually seen seasonally and seen around the same time as there's a lot of food available. Manta alfredi is reported throughout the island areas of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and it tends to be in a certain area all year round. So you can visit a certain group of islands and you will be able to see mantas throughout that period. The Manta alfredi is seen year round at the locations, and because of that it's considered resident at those locations.